Okay, awesome. If folks could wrap up their conversations now, we're going to get started. It is my pleasure to introduce Ashley Badish, Partner and Director of Western Practice Sustainable Strategies. She's going to be discussing leveraging earmarks to advance brownfields development. Please give her a round of applause.
Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. I am Ashley Badish. I'm a partner at Sustainable Strategies DC. We are a consulting, grant writing, and advocacy firm that primarily represents local governments across the country, looking to secure funding for community development priorities, including brownfields redevelopment. And so what I'm going to talk about today is how to leverage earmarks to support your brownfields redevelopment projects. Okay, so what are earmarks? They sort of rose from the dead after a long hiatus a handful of years ago at this point. These are also known as now congressionally directed spending in the Senate or community project funding in the House of Representatives. And what these are essentially grants that you secure through working with your members of Congress instead of applying to a federal agency. So you submit your project to your member of Congress, and they run the selection process for what essentially then turns into a grant like you would receive from a federal agency, but the competitive process runs through your member. And so this provides some advantages in terms of, depending on what your project is, there's a little more flexibility and a little less of a process to go through on the front end, but you do end up with the same administrative burdens as you would for managing a federal grant on the back end for your projects. Not every member of Congress submits earmarks. There's a handful of holdouts. Most members in the state of California do submit earmark requests, and every member has a different timeline and different process. So it's actually a bit of a tricky process to keep tabs on unless you're sort of proactively reaching out to your members' staff, which is what I recommend that you do to understand what their process will be, and we'll talk more about that a little later. So why earmarks matter for brownfields? So the way that earmarks work, there are several different accounts that you can apply to for earmarks that are essentially analogs to grant accounts. So it's discretionary spending that, for instance, the HUD CDBG account, Community Development Block Grants, which a lot of you are probably familiar with, has an analog earmark account that's called the Economic Development Initiative account. And so that's where your members can direct that you receive basically a CDBG grant. And so there are a handful of earmark accounts that help support priorities for brownfields redevelopment. While there is not an analog to the EPA Brownfields grant program, the accounts that I will talk about will help leverage funding for actually cleanup and remediation of properties, as well as infrastructure upgrades, transit access, community facilities, and other types of projects that you might be looking to fund for the actual redevelopment of your sites. Okay, so I'm going to actually go through these one by one, and not in painstaking detail, so if you would like the slides, I'm happy to share those afterward. So relevant accounts for earmarks. This one I already started talking about, and this is really the most frequently used account, at least that we see in our work with communities on brownfields redevelopment for brownfields projects. So the kind of funky acronyms, because you'd think, HUD, why is it THUD, come from the appropriations subcommittees. It's really kind of not even really worth discussing, but they have funky lumping of agencies into these different appropriations committees that then have these accounts. But the THUD Economic Development Initiative account We typically see projects that are successful in this account requesting up to about $1.5 million. We definitely see projects receive more than that, but sort of the sweet spot for earmarks is kind of in the $1 to $2 million request amount. Eligible activities include brownfields revitalization, community facilities, parks, arts and culture, economic development activities. The important hook on this one is that because it is like the CDBG account, your project needs to demonstrate that you are primarily serving individuals who are in low, moderate income groups, so below 80% of area median income. And that can either be, your project will primarily serve folks because you're building a social services building or something that will have kind of a service population that's limited in that way, or you can demonstrate that the area in which your project is located is primarily low, moderate income. So other accounts that we find relevant to earmark redevelopment are those that I would speak to on the discretionary spending grant side as potential grants that you might want to leverage into your into your brownfields projects as well. So those would be your water and wastewater infrastructure, transportation and transit, environmental, like disaster resilience as well. So the STAG account, and this is through EPA, is the State and Tribal Assistance Grants. These ones will cover water, sewer, and stormwater projects, and this is an analog to the state revolving loan program. So if you have water, stormwater, and wastewater needs on your brownfield sites that you would consider applying to the SRF loan program for, you can actually get an earmark that is all grant by going to your member to request the funding through STAG. And like the state revolving loan program, each of these has, sort of requirements that come under each account that you would understand by working with your member staff, but these ones have to appear in your state's intended use plan as they would if you were applying for revolving loan funding, and there is a 20% match requirement on EPA STAG. But if you would otherwise be looking at loan financing, it's a great way to lump additional grant funding into your project. And then through DOT has a couple accounts as well. They're highway infrastructure grants accounts, which really will do any kind of road and bridge infrastructure or pedestrian and bike infrastructure that you might be building on your site. And there's also transit infrastructure grants that will do transit facilities. So if you're looking to put a bus stop at one of your brownfield sites, then this would be an account that you could consider looking at as well. The federal transportation grants that are sort of an analog to these would be your FTA bus and bus facility grants or your DOT build, formerly RAISE grants, which are highly, highly competitive. And so going to your member can be a great way to try to get an extra shot at getting federal infrastructure funds for transportation projects on your brownfield site. And then a couple other ones that we have accessed for kind of depending on what the redevelopment goals are of your project. The Small Business Administration actually has an earmark account that we have worked within for brownfields projects that you're looking to build a business incubator, or you might be doing some sort of kind of small business support and assistance as it relates to the redevelopment of your site. Also, the FEMA pre-disaster mitigation account is an analog to the BRIC program, which was actually canceled, but it was formerly a program around building resilient infrastructure in communities and was really looking at like flood and hazard mitigation activities. And so on sites where you might have leaching into water supplies during flooding events or other disasters, the FEMA account is worth looking at and one of the only avenues to secure that type of funding right now since the federal grant program was canceled. There's also, for rural communities, a rural community facilities account. And this is another one that has an analog that's actually a grant and loan financing program through USDA Rural Development. So this is another opportunity to try to get all grant funding for something that you would otherwise be applying for loan financing for. And this can fund community centers, fire stations, rural facilities. There is a strict population limit of 20,000, and the match requirement is on a sliding scale that depends on your population level and the distress of your community. So, thank you. A quick success story in terms of leveraging earmarks into a brownfields project. So this is in the city of Wheeling, West Virginia, and they had a massive industrial site that they have been working on transforming into the Wheeling Gateway and Heritage Center. And they have secured now a couple of HUD EDI earmarks for this site, including to support the vertical development of the site as well as the infrastructure components. So they're going to be building trail that connects with interpretive signage, and they have these heritage tourism aspects of the site. And so all in, they now have $7 million of earmark funding that's leveraging some other federal grants that started actually with EPA Brownfields grants to remediate that site. One thing I will say is a lot of my success stories on earmarks and brownfields come from places that have members that are really good at getting earmarks. And this is a thing about earmarks that is different from sort of like the merit process where you go through the federal agency. Some members have a lot more sway in the appropriations process than others, especially those of your members who are on appropriations committees. And so they tend to be able to get these really large earmarks, like a $5 million earmark, whereas other members have a tougher time. Members of the House actually only get to make 15 requests. And so they have kind of a more limited scale of what they're able to apply for. And then senators were previously unlimited and now actually have some limits around what they can apply for as well. But you do see pretty significant variance among members in terms of what they're able to pull down year over year. So the key to successful earmark request is that you want to demonstrate broad community support, just like you're writing a grant application. So you'd be looking for letters of support, resolutions from city government, press and media articles that you can append to the application. You want to show project readiness. This is especially important for earmarks because members are really looking for things that they can host a groundbreaking on and come, hand you a big check. So they want projects that are going to move quickly. And they also, you will have to look at providing matching funds where those are required, and your members will sometimes, try to look into how real the matches that you have and how shovel-ready you'll be upon award. And then you want to align your projects with member priorities and consider their committee roles, because they often try to award earmarks that sort of align with their committee roles and then also their priorities. So another thing that's advantageous about earmarks is if your community's projects and priorities are misaligned with the federal agencies, with the executive branch, but they align with your members, then earmarks are an avenue that you could still be requesting, for instance, clean energy and resilience and other types of projects that the current administration is not otherwise looking for at this time. So some steps for your community. So you want to identify your priority brownfield redevelopment projects that might be ripe for an earmark, and really consider what ask you could make in that sort of $1 to $2 million range that would help get you to the next step of your redevelopment process. And then you're going to want to actually be reaching out to your members' staffers early next year. So you would be you can actually really just pick up the phone and call the DC office number for your member of Congress and ask who their appropriations staffer is and ask them, when are your earmark deadlines going to be? And if you start doing that early next year, then you'll have an idea of what their application process will look like. And then you want to start meeting with them sooner than later to tell the story about your projects so that they are interested and and if you have the opportunity to talk to your member directly about it, sometimes those opportunities arise, they come to town, you see them at an event. That's a good opportunity to take any of those occasions and inform them about your projects. And then, as I mentioned, you want to be gathering letters of support and stakeholder endorsements for those projects as well. So key takeaways: flexible alternative funding path to competitive grants. They fit well, especially under the HUD, EPA, and DOT accounts. You want to start early because most of the deadlines that offices will set will fall between March and April. And then you also want strong local support and readiness to maximize your success. So I think we're at time, but happy to take a few questions if folks have any. That's a great question. So because the funding is tied to the appropriation process, it can take, you want to be looking at projects that are at least a year out for receiving the funding. So you would submit your application in April, and then they'll do sort of a review process and then submit their priorities to the subcommittee over the summer, like May, June. And then the next step is actually like the federal budget. And so happening live now in September, the earmarks from March and April are currently wound up in that budget process. And so if we end up with a shutdown or a continuing resolution or some other form of delay, that carries all of the earmarks with it. So you can end up with continuing resolutions that sort of like kick you all the way into the next year. So typically I would recommend that you be looking at projects that you don't need the funding for at least a year. Thanks, everyone.